So I'm going to keep the ball rolling with our next set of panels. We're going to talk a little bit about how to shine the light on what it takes to protect critical business systems, really understand kind of the evolution of cybersecurity and cyber resiliency, and to proactively protect digital infrastructures. Please warm up. Let's give a warm round of applause for our next panel as they get ready to come out here. First, we'll welcome CEO of Cyxtera Technologies, Nelson Fonseca, who is homegrown. We'll also welcome Merritt Baer, who is the principal of AWS Office of the CISO. Next, we'll have Leo. Let's give them a round of applause as they walk out here. I know it's early, but we're excited for the talks to kick off. Leo Taddeo, who's the CISO and president of Appgate Federal. Leo, do you want to come on out here? And finally, this conversation is going to be moderated by Brian White, who is a partner at BDO Partners. Come on, guys, I know it's early. Let's give everybody a round of applause. Brian, you can take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you. Here we go. So thank you all for joining us. We're excited to have the opportunity to talk about cybersecurity here. I'm sure that's what everybody wants to learn about. But hopefully what we do is leave you with some practical perspectives. We know there's a long and diverse audience here that has different experience with cyber. And so when you think about something as cybersecurity and pulling in just this really dynamic panel here, is, how has it changed over the years? Because one thing that I have been in the industry for 20 plus years now, and many of us have too, and I always try to think about where are we on the continuum? How has it changed? And I think that's a good way to start giving this audience a nice framework so we can think about cyber a little, and put it and think what it means for us. So why don't we start, with Nelson to talk a little bit about how it's changed from Terramark to what you're doing today at Cyxtera.
Yeah, so I'm one of those that's been in the industry for over 20 years as well. And when we had founded a company named Terramark at that time, all the discussion about cybersecurity, this is when folks and companies were just starting to take infrastructure away from their office and put it in a third-party facility. That alone introduced a number of cybersecurity constraints because you no longer had control of the physical servers in your perimeter. Then, a few years later, about a decade later, then the public cloud came. And now, obviously, with AWS, now you started sharing those servers, which now became, again, another potential security constraint. So what I would say is, no matter how IT infrastructure evolves, which is really the foundation of the digital economy, cybersecurity needs to evolve with it. And so that's what we've seen over those last 20 years.
And Merritt, you've seen it from, you have a lot of government experience, but a lot of industry experience too. Maybe take us through just kind of when you first got into this, when you were on Capitol Hill, to then working for the Department of Homeland Security, to now at Amazon, kind of how you've seen it evolve and what you've seen in each specific place you've been.
Yeah, so thanks folks for being here. I know all of you probably have places you could otherwise be, so we appreciate your personhood and your attention. And it's, hard to follow Serena Williams, but we will try to keep this interesting. We are on Tequesta, Miccosukee, and Creekland. And as mentioned, I'm a principal in the office of the Ciso at AWS, Amazon Web Services, or the cloud. And the question was just how the angles that I've worked in security have kind of shaped my perspective. And I've been in and out of government in all three branches, and now obviously working for the predominant cloud provider. So I think, one of the things that we see is this kind of shared fate, where security is one of those issues that when we get better at it, we all benefit. And so I think there's a lot of freshness and humanity there. So for folks who are thinking about getting in the field, it is sometimes an intimidating field to think about, but actually there's a lot of reason to believe that there is a place for you here. And in conjunction with that, you see that folks are thinking about security in terms of business differentiation. So whether that business is a government entity that is delivering policy outcomes, or whether it is a business in, pharma or hospitality or any of the, entertainment. You can see, Formula One runs on AWS. There are a lot of different ways that you are interacting with the infrastructure of IT and with the security that they have put in place by virtue of that. And so I think the answer is there's actually a lot of similarity, or at least belief that we are chasing some of the same goals. Of course, the vantage point that you have will change over time, but as we see this shift to the cloud, we see these development cycles moving to where security is embedded in everything you do. And that means that we have to have those conversations, and also that we are able to be more creative and more innovative and do more at scale. And there's a lot of sweetness there and a lot of promise, and I'm gonna try to get you to come work for us before I finish today.
So she's really here to recruit for Amazon? She's just putting it out there.
For the security world writ large, really, yeah.
But Leo, I know many of this audience probably could ask you questions about the FBI, all day. And just to make it clear, we're not doing too much bios, but Leo's got a distinguished career in the FBI before joining first Cyxtera and then Appgate. And so maybe speak a bit about that experience and how that formative experience kind of led to your transition into kind of the private sector, and the similarities between them, and kind of how you're seeing the threat evolve given that unique lens you had.
Yeah, great question. So I'll just walk the audience through a timeline. In the 90s, as from a law enforcement point of view, from an FBI agent's point of view, the cyber challenge was recovering evidence that we found on a criminal's computer. That was the extent of the cyber challenge in the 90s. In the early 2000s, we saw more of a transition of criminals using computers or using the internet to commit crimes. And so our aperture had to open so that we can conduct investigations not just of something we could grab at a person's house, for example, like a hard drive or a laptop. We now had to build out capabilities to investigate and recover evidence in a wider internet platform. And as the country and the rest of the world shifts its social and financial activity more and more onto the digital platforms, law enforcement and the intelligence community have to adapt their tools in order to apply the same security controls. So if you think about it, we live in a physical world that's evolved over thousands of years to have things like police departments and fire departments and construction crews to recover from emergencies. We've left that capability behind in the physical world and moved into the digital world without building those security features into it. And so we have some making up to do. I think predicting the future is going to be a real challenge. The collective security we see in cloud platforms like AWS are great, but they don't remove the responsibility for security from anyone who is on that platform. And so we still see security breaches and we still see incidents. The last 5 or 10 years really have been about this awakening in various nation states to the value of developing a cyber capability and applying it in their military and diplomatic efforts in the spectrum of continuity for the application of force. And so that's a really scary thing to consider when more and more of our infrastructure is digital, which means that more and more of it is exposed to nation states that don't have to physically be here in order to have a negative impact. And so the question for us, and Merritt and I have worked on similar problems in government, is how does the country shift resources from traditional security controls that are still very important to these digital controls? And that's an effort that is being undertaken by both private sector and the government. So that's in a nutshell how I see it.
And I think what we'll do at the end is kind of pull back and maybe pull on some of those specific recommendations that I think you have in mind here. But I think you led to a nice topic, which is what's transpiring right now in the world, which is, it's clear that what's transpiring in Ukraine is awful and really beyond words. For the cyber community in particular, it has been something that we've watched because we've anticipated much more increased threat activity. And so, for this audience, how has, your operations changed? Have they changed? have you been watching certain things? Have you seen, things happening on your infrastructure? And I'm going to start with Merritt here. In particular, is there a certain playbook or things that you do differently based on kind of how you see, overall events following, particularly from the Office of the Ciso?
Well, as we have alluded, in cloud, we, your cloud provider, there's a shared responsibility model. So we are taking care of our side, so, the security of the cloud. And you, the customer, are then maintaining the security of your resources in the cloud. And so on our side, we're always paranoid, right? So yes, we have, threat feeds, and we are watching everything from the edge down, so layer 7. But we also have custom hardware that we have built intentionally that allows for no human access. And there are ways that you can use technological controls to ensure that you have minimized your threat vectors. Certainly, I think in this context, a lot of times what you're actually thinking about are behavioral kinds of considerations. And those are just ways that folks are, getting credentials not secured or other things. And those are on, customers to think through how they can best protect themselves. Zero trust is kind of a buzzword right now. But for us, I think that translates to not relying in some binary sense on a perimeter-based mentality or on those fine-grained identity-centric controls, but having them coupled and even ideally augmenting and aware of one another. So something like a VPC endpoint policy for my geeks in the audience, but things that are providing defense in depth in the sense that you have provided both technical and human layer kind of uppercase and lowercase p policies that minimize your risk. And of course, in the cloud, your forensics are your logging and monitoring. You're not going to get into the host. That's on our side, which is good because then you don't have to worry about it. So a lot of what you're going to be doing is looking at your data. So thinking about how you're going to do analytics and extract insights and then take actions upon them, automating your security. The only way to really do security at scale is with a lot of automation.
And Nelson, maybe you can speak a bit about how modern compute, and even what we were talking about backstage, kind of the evolution from Terramark to Cyxtera, kind of the software platform you have, how has that made cyber either easier or harder for organizations as they've adopted into this kind of hybrid world?
Yeah, I don't think it's easier. I don't think it's going to become any easier because the world of infrastructure is changing so fast. And so as that rapid change in infrastructure, it requires security to evolve with it. I'm proud to have both cloud, AWS is part of our stack, and also Appgate is a part of our stack. And the way we view infrastructure at Cyxtera is it's all hybrid. So the larger you become as an organization, the more you need to evolve your infrastructure to support your business needs. You want to be a secure company, you want to have secure infrastructure, but you want to be a successful company that makes money. And so what happens with security is it has to track what your business needs. And so we view it as hybrid. We subscribe to a zero trust view of security because it allows us, and more importantly, the customers that are in our data center to be able to pick and choose what applications they run wherever they need it. Some of them will be in the cloud, some of it will be in their data center, in our data center. So I don't think it gets any easier. I think the world is evolving. Digital infrastructure continues to evolve. It's evolving more rapidly, so security is going to evolve with it.
Yeah, and Leo, why don't you pull on that a little bit too? But take us through kind of any specific things that you have now seen related to kind of the geopolitical environment, if you have. And how modern compute coupled with the threat environment together are kind of continuing to just complicate the challenges for your customers and what they think about when they're evaluating Appgate technology or other technologies. Kind of how do they think about what's the right way to build a stack, being mindful of just the nature of the landscape changing so constantly?
Right, so Nelson mentioned the hybrid infrastructure, which is absolutely true, that every enterprise out there, government agency, doesn't have one flavor of infrastructure. They have every flavor of infrastructure, whether they know it or not. And so
technically, that is not true, right? There are folks that are all in on one or another, but many are hybrid.
Well, their laptops are probably on-prem. That's part of their infrastructure. So the endpoint is still in the hands of a user. And so you have something in your hand that's on-prem that you have to protect. Yeah. You have something in the cloud, like AWS, which is a fine service, And then many are accessing software as a service where parts of that service are in co-location facilities like Cyxtera. So whether we really don't know what infrastructure is behind the service we're seeing on our screen, but the service provider has to worry about it, and we have to think about it differently. So we mentioned zero trust, and people say, well, really, what is that? And what it is a departure from the old way of thinking about perimeters. So in past years, defense was built around a strategy where you took your important stuff and put it behind a firewall and built a perimeter around it. And access was granted primarily based on the origin of the request. So if it came from within the perimeter, it was implicitly trusted and access was granted. And that was a great vector for our adversaries. Once they got inside the perimeter, they had access to everything else that was inside the perimeter because there was this implicit trust. And what zero trust does is it changes that quite a bit to say, do not trust anything, whether it comes from inside the perimeter or outside the perimeter. You have to authenticate, validate, and dynamically monitor and control all of your access. And so zero trust is really a fundamental not only for defending against every type of major network exploitation that we see, but also in the hybrid world where you have connections coming from no one really knows where in some cases. And so I think the important mindset that we have to adapt to is the idea that there no longer is a perimeter where everything inside is safe and trusted. We have to adopt zero trust, and in many ways it is a buzzword and a marketing banner, but it also is a fundamental change in how we should be thinking about protecting hybrid infrastructure and how we should be defending against attacks that are primarily based on credential exploitation and network exploitation.
Yeah. And I want to quickly pull on Merritt here, because I know she doesn't like the term zero trust. Can you elaborate?
Yeah, you know, some of these industry buzzwords kind of mean everything and nothing. And I think that while it can be a useful framework, or, you know, if you find it helpful in your enterprise to, use it in a way that allows you to beef up your understanding of how security can operate, then great. And I think, you know, as we've described, I think it is mostly understood to be this approach that does not rely on solely on perimeters or on, you know, the internal fine-grained identity-centric controls. That being said, folks use zero trust all the time for marketing. It's like military-grade encryption. Yeah, well, you know what? Like, that means nothing. You know, it's either AES 256, which is the best we got right now, or it's not, right? And so I think there's also a healthy skepticism that we all can have for some of these industry buzzwords in terms of what we choose to find meaning in and how we ascribe that meaning and the definitions that we ensure we are adopting so that folks can meaningfully participate in the conversations we have.
That's great. And as I want to get a bit more tactical to hopefully continue to give this audience with maybe some specific things to take away. And let's start first with, you know, what's transpired over the past 2 years with the pandemic has, you know, led to major changes in society. And we're not here to talk about all of them, but let's talk about in particular what has happened in work from home. What has happened with how we actually now kind of build a workforce that's, you know, around the country, working at all hours around the world. What type of risks has that introduced that we did not have as perhaps acute before? And also kind of what should organizations be doing to really enable that, but also kind of what do security teams need to be mindful of? And why don't we start with Nelson, you know, maybe from the perspective of both managing a large company and what you've done and how you've thought through this, but also maybe some of the specifics in terms of, you know, what may be happening at Cyxtera's technology.
Yeah, it impacted us really in two ways. We have, you know, 61 data centers across the globe, and what we always talk about flexibility for our customers, and what the pandemic brought to light is the need for flexibility. So the IT needed to be more distributed because all of a sudden all their employees were working from home, their partners were working from home, and so how do you get all that and get all that compute and that infrastructure closer to the user so they had a good experience and your company could continue to perform and continue to evolve? Most of us saw it in video, in Zoom and apps like that, but it really affected a number of applications for all of our customers, and we really cater to kind of large enterprises. So The fact that within our data centers they had that flexibility was very, very important, but it also put a lot of pressure on cybersecurity, right? That's why the more flexible you need your IT infrastructure to be, the more flexible your cybersecurity needs to be. Then because we have a global footprint, that's what we were doing for our customers. We ourselves had to make sure that we could support those customers as well. We were obviously all working remotely. I will put a shout out to our data center employees. We had employees that were in our data centers throughout the pandemic. And so where folks were living at home and were able to spend a little bit of time with their family, our data center staff was in the data center 24/7, 365 days a year. And so our job is to keep that infrastructure running. So if the data centers weren't running, Zoom wasn't running. So from our perspective, it was a difficult time, but we were able to see it through. And I think it's because of the flexibility of our IT infrastructure and the flexibility of the security posture that we use across the company.
And Merritt, I think Amazon's always been quite flexible, being geographically dispersed, work from home. But anything specifically or tactically that the Office of the Ciso did to put in place as it became more widespread, less focused on the facilities?
Yeah, so of course, from a big part of my job, I sit in AWS security, so I help us secure ourselves. But a big part of my job is helping customers too. They'll say like, how are you approaching this? And certainly we saw an emphasis on that endpoint security, and of course, the move to cloud is very consistent with the idea that you now can know, you can know from a virtualized standpoint without having to go out and check whether computers are plugged in and whether, John brought a thumb drive into the office today. And so there's actually a lot more coherent storytelling that you can do on your security from an endpoint perspective if you are leveraging, virtualization and cloud. That being said, it played out for us in a couple of ways that I think, one, folks who had accessibility challenges, now there was no excuse because it kind of showed that it could be done. So I think in some ways COVID has been a big enabler for folks to believe that you can do things remotely, and I think it may have had some positives. But two, on the human level, I think we saw it play out that like burnout and the ability to collaborate and the kinds of things that made people excited about their job were harder to get. And it was harder to find that kind of like drinking from the well moment where you're excited and you have new ideas and you collaborate with your teammates. And if you're writing code, you're leaning over each other's shoulders. There was less of that, and there was even more of a toll for those of us who are caregivers, which is disproportionately women. And so I think the reality on the human side was certainly a cost.
Got it. Now, very helpful and important points you highlight. Leo, be a bit tactical about what you think people have implemented, what will stay, and maybe some things that may go away as we kind of transition perhaps a little bit more into the office and in the technology stacks that people use now.
So one thing that we all agree on is that COVID accelerated what was already happening, and that was more and more people were discovering that they could be more efficient working from home. And so that acceleration cast a spotlight on legacy security tools. It showed that what was working for a model in the 1990s and early 2000s wasn't going to work for the modern workforce. And so you see tools like VPNs, which were developed in the 90s, struggling to adapt, not only because major vulnerabilities were discovered in VPNs and publicized, but vulnerabilities that were known for a long time but finally came to light, but also because of performance issues. VPNs aren't designed for multiple connections. They're not designed for great throughput, and many times they require network routing that creates latency and bandwidth issues. And so when you think about having everyone in the office and working through infrastructure that is on premises and partly perhaps in the cloud and partly off-site in a co-location facility, you now have everybody working at home, and a VPN isn't the answer. So that's one tool. You have other tools that only work on premises, like network access controls. They only work if you have a building and you have facilities that you can actually connect with a physical wire. So we saw that tool become less and less useful. So I think what we're going to see is an adoption of more of software as security, code as security, and a move away from appliances and tools that really don't adapt well to the new workforce.
That's super helpful. You know, there's a lot of early stage companies here, and one of the issues that I'm constantly thinking through is how do you secure an early stage company? Is, you know, using AWS enough? I'm sure you're going to say yes. But when do you need a Ciso? Is there a certain employee threshold? Is there a certain way, a framework? You know, what's the ideal, you know, Appgate or Cyxtera customer? And how do you talk to somebody that's just thinking about, what do I need to do? So why don't we, you know, kidding aside, why don't we pull on Merritt on how they're thinking through this?
Yeah, so I think, and this is, like, I do work for AWS, but this is just kind of a fact in the world that if you are in cloud, right, you inherit the security that we are doing on your behalf, which includes a lot of complex hardware security and things that you don't want to own, but also the ability to do, you know, scalable work. So having the ability to have that flexibility to scale up and down with your cycles, to know what you're paying for, those kinds of things are really useful if you're a startup, obviously. And from a security perspective, you know, your security decision making starts the minute that you're architecting. You will pick what region you're in. You will start building resources. You will start putting guardrails around them and permissioning. So actually, you know, as Nelson and I have alluded to, you know, like it has security, I think traditionally, which is to say in the past, like was something that was more bolted on after development cycles. That is not the case now. It just can't be. So sure, you may have, and as you grow, probably will likely develop a core AppSec team, for example, or at least the functionality residing in some of your engineers. But like there are increasingly tools to do clean code reviews. What you're really looking at is how you're architecting, what decisions you're making, which database you're choosing to use, how warm you're keeping your storage, how you're doing life cycling around those, how you're creating these kinds of decision making. So things like AWS organizations that allow you to govern down decision making and permissioning, and then to reason about what you've done. All of this resides in the fact that we are doing infrastructure as code, and so then you can do security as code. And so this is a very scalable thing that also doesn't require you to write Python. So you're interacting with things as API calls, and there's a lot of accessibility there, and there's also that kind of built-in access to make security-minded decisions. But to answer, I mean, my personal view is that you should have a CISO as soon as you have any other C-suite person. Like if you are more than a one-person shop, you should have someone whose role is Chief Security Officer or Chief Information Security Officer. I get that in small shops, you may be dual-hatted or something, but there should be someone with whom the security decision-making resides, because one thing we have found is that you don't have to hire a security engineer to be embedded into those teams. What you do is you ask at least an engineer, we're now at like a 1-to-8 ratio in our development teams, to be the security mind. We call them guardian champions. And they're the person who, you know, when your devs are like, let's just put ** in that policy and allow everything through and we'll just see if it works. They're like, no, we're not gonna do that. First of all, we already have guardrails up. That's not gonna go through as a build. But second of all, it shouldn't, because we don't need an internet-facing endpoint here or whatever it is, right? And so having someone whose kind of remit is to think in terms of what security-minded person would do is really healthy for an enterprise. And to be honest, you know, these days, I think increasingly your CEO, or you know, you if you are the CEO, will know that security is not just, you know, possibly the product that you are delivering in the case of a company like Cyxtera, but it's actually just an inherent part of the value proposition of any company is the security that you have allowed yourself to embed in what you're delivering. And so it's really a business driver and an imperative. You know, it's not an option to decide to put on security later.
I think it's a great framework to embed security from the outset, make it clear that it's somebody's responsibility, so then it becomes part of the organization's DNA. Just one more quickly on this one, and then we'll move to a different topic. Nelson, you know, you've helped, you know, found companies, you've helped mentor companies from Medina Capital. What type of advice do you give them about thinking through their stack from a board perspective?
Well, look, one, I'll agree with Merritt. The cloud does a great job. But public cloud is a very powerful tool for you to start a company and be able to inherit the cybersecurity investments that were already being made. So a lot of early stage companies, that's what they depend on. That's what they should depend on. We've invested in a number of companies that have used those capabilities. So I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. I guess the second thing is you really can't have an infrastructure discussion without cyber. Digital infrastructure it needs to have cyber in mind. So from day one, you have to have that in mind. So you can't just pick the public cloud because it was the easiest. It has to be part of your vision for the company, especially if your company requires digital infrastructure as a key component of the company. So that's what we tell all the companies that we've invested in. Obviously, as you grow and you expand, things become a little bit more interesting, right? You may now have some SaaS products, right, for your back office system. And then that creates another cybersecurity potential vector. And so it's a constant thing. Brian, you can't just, there isn't, hey, this is the playbook that you need to follow, because it does change so rapidly. But I think we would all agree on the panel that it's something that cybersecurity is something you need to focus on with your business from day one, and it doesn't go away. I couldn't imagine running Cyxtera today without a Ciso. It would not be a good thing for us. So I think most companies are in that situation.
No, I think that was a good framework. Let's just touch on gaps that remain. And maybe a couple of quick thoughts from each of you on this one. What gaps do you still see in the ecosystem that you are either surprised are still there, or that you would encourage entrepreneurs in this audience, hey, that's an area where I think that there needs to be some urgency of development? Anything jump to mind, Leo?
Yeah, I think it depends on the size of the enterprise. And like all security questions, it's a matter of balancing risks. And so if you're very small, your gaps are going to be different than if you're a larger infrastructure company like Cyxtera or AWS. But for what applies, I think, across all of the sizes of enterprises is the interface between the user and the infrastructure. That's still the main vulnerability, where we have either untrained, uncareful, or lax security protocols within the user, or you have legacy access controls, legacy credentials, legacy identity management, and legacy monitoring. So for me, the gap that applies across all enterprises, no matter what the size, is how do we prevent the wrong person from accessing sensitive data? And so to flip that on its head, the question becomes, how do we get the right person to access the right data at only the right time? And to me, that is a user access control question, and it's a gap that applies across all enterprises.
Good point. Perspectives, Merritt, on that one?
I mean, I'll echo Serena Williams here and say, one obvious gap is in workforce, right? We still remain, security and tech more broadly are really not representative, and that is important. It not only plays out in that we build weaker security, but we also don't see folks, being able to participate in the technologies we're building, since, as we've emphasized, security engineers are builders these days, right? And so I think it matters for all of us, and for folks who are in the audience who are, first grade teachers or architects or whatever, who think, I don't see myself in the current makeup of security professionals. Like, no, get in, the water is warm and it matters. And I think increasingly, as we do have these infrastructure as code and security as code approaches, it means that we're seeing sort of higher order reasoning. We have a group at AWS that is called the Automated Reasoning Group, and they do basically formal math to prove that you know what you think you know. So we don't go out and try to count all prime numbers, we accept the infinitude of primes to be true, right? And in that vein, now that you're doing infrastructure as code and security as code, you can validate that you know what you know, you scope these problems, and it's just fascinating. It echoes back to this sense that computers could do more than simple calculations, that they could enact reasoning, and that there is this kind of space for creativity that will always be at some level at the command of a human. And so it really matters that we have folks participating in these ecosystems and building the technologies and the security that enables those technologies that are the kinds of future that we want to see.
I think that's a great point, and something we should all be very mindful of. You know what, we have less than a minute here left. I do want to just quickly get maybe 15 seconds each, if I hurry up here, on personal security. Leave people in this audience with, what do you do? Anything that you've done, personally that people should think about doing? Start with Nelson and quickly go down.
Yeah, so look, I struggle with that like everyone else, right? I've used a couple of apps to try to kind of manage my passwords. We're a pretty big family at home as well, so I got 3 kids, and so trying to manage all that, it gets difficult. So it's a constant challenge, Brian. I don't have the answer for you.
It's hard for you too.
Yeah.
Merritt, anything you're doing?
Use 2FA. That'll eliminate a lot of your threats. Use 2FA on everything you can, but
Two-factor authentication.
especially your banking and things that are likely to be a target. And if you get a call from someone saying they're Apple and they need your ID or whatever, or United Airlines and they need to validate, always say, I'm going to call you back. You initiate the call to the vendor. Don't let the vendor call you to validate something.
Absolutely. Password management is the key in our consumer life. Whenever we access a service or an account, inevitably it's all about passwords and two-factor authentication. The better you manage that, the safer you will be. The other aspect is social engineering, and is to be very much on guard, because social engineering has become super sophisticated and highly effective, especially for other family members who might not be as sophisticated as you are, whether they're young or old, and not paying as much attention. So your security is tied up with the rest of your family's security, and being able to help them manage their passwords, whether they're very young or very old or somehow not capable, that's an important part of each and every one of our own security postures.
That's great. Great points. Well, listen, please join me in giving this panel a warm, thank you. They were very helpful and terrific. Thank you.